Shane White, and this is The Process.
Hey gang, Shane Patrick White here with another edition of The Process. Today on The Process, we're going to do a second advanced cross-hatching. Now the first one was a little more freeform, and I was trying out a new technique, and this one is a little different because it's cross-hatching traditionally, and I'm using a new ink. It's a supposedly bulletproof, waterproof Noodler's ink. The reason why I chose Noodler's ink, it's known for its really good flow and has a really nice consistency when using a crow quill. A few years back, I picked up some fountain pens and I was getting into that a little bit. And the kind of ink that works best with fountain pens is a brand that the company that I ordered from, I think it's Goulet Pens and Company. They promote or use a lot of Noodler ink in different colors, different styles, non-feathering, waterproof, water-resistant, all kinds of different inks. And so I picked up about 3 bottles of the stuff, just different things that they had available. Unfortunately, at the time, the waterproof ink was out. The first thing you'll notice if you actually purchase Noodler's ink is that it has a fragrance to it. It's really, it smells so good. You just want to keep inking all day long. And since I'm really sensitive to smells, I really prefer it. But I prefer it mostly for the fountain pens. It works really well. The cleanup is good. It doesn't clog the pen at all. And so I've taken the ink that I already have, the stuff that's not water resistant, and I've tried a few crow quill pieces with it, and I liked how it flowed. When I finally found a jar of waterproof ink, I was on board. I was like, man, I'm going to try that with this larger illustration. Now, like with most illustrations, I start off with background elements that aren't too demanding as far as what's necessary to make the piece look good. I'm trying to get a feel for the ink. I'm trying to get a feel for the crow quill. I'm using a Hunt 102. I chose the 102 over the 107 because it has a lot more spring and bounce to it, and I wanted a little more variable line when inking with it. So when rendering rocks, it's always good to have reference, and in lieu of reference, there's a few things to keep in mind. Defining edges, at least trying to break up rocks into 3 or 4 values helps, and to remember your light source. You don't want to forget your light source, because once you forget your light source, then it just becomes a big blobby mess of lines. Like in my other inking videos, you'll notice that I spin the image around so I can get the best line work possible, because I'm pulling a lot of my lines away from my body. That's generally how I use the crow quill. Sometimes I'll pull it towards my body, but it's pretty rare. The natural flow is a 45-degree angle, planting your elbow on the table, or from your wrist if you want shorter strokes. And don't be afraid to push down on the Hunt 102. It's a steel nib. When you push down on the Hunt 102, the flexible nib will give you a nice variable line weight, which is great for outlining. It's more expressive, so take advantage of the tool as it was meant to be used. I originally drew this illustration with the blue color erase pencil. I like working in blue because I know when I scan it, it does not interfere with the scan. It's also very forgiving when it comes to erasing and just illustration in general. A lot of animators use it for traditional animation and layout. With the rocks inked, I now start tackling the figure. I have a little more confidence, I have an idea of how the pen works in my hand and how the ink lays down. Like traditional comics or illustration, I could outline things, or I could let light be the guide to creating form. With this piece, I think I'm going to do a little bit of both. I actually added a lot of sweet detail that I knew the pen would really respond to, and it also makes for an interesting illustration. Now, with this type of illustration, which is, I guess, would be considered good girl art or science fiction good girl art, the costumes are usually very impractical. So, for instance, her bare thighs are open to the dead cold of space, but she doesn't seem to mind. So the impractical lacing up of the leggings with sort of a cord, I knew that was going to be a lot of fun to ink. So that was one of the ideas I wanted to try, and liked how it turned out. One of the main things I think I was interested in was breaking up large areas that could just end up being very simplistic, very flat. I wanted the eye to be able to sit on something for a little bit and absorb the details, to wonder, why was this suit made this way? Who made this suit? Because in the expanse of space, there's going to be a lot of black background. Now, one could say, hey, I'm going to fill that in solid black, but I've tried that before and it looks dead. It looks really bad, especially against Crowquill. It's not to say that you can't make it work, because I'm sure you can. It's just in the application and the illustration I tried it on once, I didn't like the results. I may try it again in the future, but I'm going to have to think about it a little bit differently and see if I can pull something out of it that makes sense for me. Maybe I needed to work better in my transitions between solid black and anything else that wasn't black. Now, as I ink this piece, I'm looking at some of the challenges that are going to be coming up for me. And one of them is the bubble helmet. Since I don't have the luxury of being able to use ellipse guides with this pen, or even French curves, because it's just difficult to actually track the pen along any edge, especially one that's plastic and probably pitted, I'm going to have to do it freehand. That requires me inking a lot more, getting more confident, and then figuring out how to get those strokes to make sense to fully create the bubble helmet. Details like seams and the like will help create more realism in a piece like this. It also gives you an opportunity to create cinch points for the fabric to bunch up in. And yes, I am actually kind of outlining this a little bit more than I had probably originally started out doing, but that's okay. I'll try to find a way to make it work. Another challenge for me is shading the breast area. I know that's kind of the whole reason for the piece, isn't it? Being a guy, that is part of the intrigue, I suppose, is to make sure that all the sexy pieces fall into place. And that means being able to do them well. I think in the past, I always had problems getting that nice curved line for the breasts or the hips or anything else that was curvy and cute. I'm thinking, how am I going to render these? Even though I have the drawing underneath to follow, which by the way, if you draw the strokes in the pencil stage, it does give you a guideline to figure out where the strokes are going. And even though I have the guideline of those strokes, I'm still a little bit nervous because I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to deal with the cross hatching. To start, I'll work on a planet in the background, which is also kind of rounded. Now, in this case, I am doing a style of cross-hatching that is a little more traditional. It uses a lot of 45 on 45 degree angles to build up to a certain value. So if you think about it this way, the pattern usually goes 45 and 45 would make like an X, and then you have a horizontal, and then you have a vertical. And if you rinse and repeat that over a large span, that's probably your darkest dark that is measurable in terms of value. You're thinking, okay, that can also be adjusted by how close those lines are together or how far they are apart. As the illustration goes on, you'll see what I'm talking about. I know the background needs to be as dark as I can get it, so I'm going to try my best to make those lines very close. But because I have to cover a large area, it's going to be very difficult. One of my favorite things to crosshatch are planets. I just love building up these really bumpy surfaces and trying to choose a light source that makes sense. It recalls times of when I discovered Wally Wood's artwork and how well he created these planet shapes. Usually what I'll do is I'll do a first pass on a lot of these items, which I know I'll go back and revisit to adjust. A lot of this is about getting down that first impression and then making adjustments in relation to everything else that you've done. So a lot of the light will be adjusted because you have less control in the moment as you lay down individual areas of crow quill. It's kind of like painting. You put down your first best guess based on what you know in that moment and lighting scenario. And then you start judging it more against the colors that you've put down as you've judged in the colors that are in front of you. In this case, I have nothing really in front of me. I haven't done a value study beyond the illustration itself. So I have to take the elements as they are and try to figure out where's the focal point, how do they relate in terms of value with other elements in that scene, and then where do I push and pull the light in the form. For instance, that back leg, the longest leg, I wanted to push that more into shadow. So I'm going to have to keep that in mind as I keep pushing on. I actually want it to blend in a little bit more with the background. But in the meantime, it's important to get down the details as clearly as you want them to stand out. If If you're a fan of Gil Elvgren or Adam Hughes or Roberto Vargas or even George Petty, these are other good girl artists who have made a name for themselves throughout the years, who are influencing people even today. I've always liked Gil Elvgren's work, and I've found a few other people I liked. I like George Petty's work too, but it gets a little abstract and weird at some point in his career. The heads start getting really large, and they don't even look like cartoons. They just kind of look bizarre. But for me, Elvgren is, I think, like a lot of people, is kind of like the gold standard for good girl art. I have actually inked a few Gil Elvgren pieces to try and understand what's it take to make a pretty picture, as it were. It's hard. It's really difficult. And it's all in the face too. I mean, yes, it's in the body as well, but if you don't get that face down, if you don't get that joy, that esprit that comes with the style of good girl art that he's done, then I think you're gonna miss the point. Now with this piece, this was the first piece I had done that I was going to do a series, and so I wanted to do at least 3. I had done a piece before this that I really liked, but I wanted to do something that had a little more, a little more something else going on. I think what it was is usually in space scenes and good girl art or whatever, the woman is usually frightened or scared of something. I wanted someone who was a little more tough, a little more in control, and I really liked her facial expression. I also wanted to do dreadlocks too, so I was like, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's try it. But the problem was I fell in love with the face. It happens. You fall in love with an aspect of a drawing at the risk of the rest of the drawing not working. And I was having problems with fitting the leg onto the image. So by the time I finished the actual drawing itself, kind of realized the head was a little too large. So I kept enlarging the figure until the long leg got out of hand and started going outside the border. And so I got frustrated. I thought, okay, let me just redraw this again and see if I can trace the face off onto another board in a better position and redraw it. So I did. Unfortunately, the face never looked as good as it did the first time. And that's the problem with falling in love with pretty girls. It's just, I don't know what happened. I could not figure out why the face, I couldn't make it work. I'm at a level now that when I want to change something, I have the confidence that I can wrangle the image back to where it needs to be for it to be what I intended, if that makes sense. But there are going to be some outliers, like this face, for instance, that I can't recreate. I can't fix it. I can't make it better. And so I ended up drawing an entire new drawing of this piece with a different face. The proportions are better. The image is still interesting, but it's not as lovely as this. In fact, I think at some point, I don't think I'll make another video like this again, but because it was a real hassle, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of footage here because crow quill inking takes a long time. And even though this is sped up immensely, it took 2 days to ink this thing. I'm talking like full 6 to 8 hours to finish. So the other piece, while it is different, it's still fine. I think the proportions are better and I'm happier with the overall look of it. So in some cases, this is kind of a test piece for me. It's to say, okay, if I'm dealing with this many elements and this environment and this kind of landscape of lighting, how do I deal with it? How do I make sure that everything reads correctly? And what's nice is I don't have to worry about screwing this up. I mean, I may screw it up. I hope I don't, because trying to fix these kinds of illustrations are not particularly easy. In some cases, you actually have to cut out a new piece of paper and paste it over the illustration to make it work again. And I wasn't about to do that, so So it took a while, but eventually I ended up inking the breast. And the thing about this is I really want that transition to work, to be beautiful, to make it make sense in the outfit. Unfortunately, the ink was starting to react differently. If you notice, there is some really, really fine hairline inking, and then there's some bolder strokes in there, and I couldn't figure out why that was happening. I thought, well, maybe I pushed down a little too hard. Maybe there's something about there wasn't enough ink on the nib. Sometimes that happens. And so I got a little worried that having to go over it as much as I did to get the form correct, that I might be screwing it up. It might be gumming up the works. Another important thing about cross-hatching is this, squinting. I've said it in other videos before, but squinting for value will help you judge whether or not the transitions, whether or not the values are working correctly. It will also show you where the ink lines gather and start looking a little bit splotchy in the rest of the piece. So when you see that happening, you're able to balance it out by either building more transition in the actual area or finding ways to break it up. Now you'll notice there was a little mishap. Somehow I fumbled the crow quill and it fell out of my hand and splashed on the image. And it was at that point that I panicked a little bit. I was kind of miffed, obviously, because I wanted a pristine image and even more so a pristine border. But now I have to use whiteout for the border at the very least. But how do I make that mistake work in the final image? Now, because I'm not using solid black for the backgrounds, I have to find a way to convince the viewer that the transition I make makes sense. So I'll probably do some heavier cross-hatching in that area. That means the background will be a bit more splotchy than I intended. But because there is a large expanse of black background, I'm going to have to do strokes in short form, as you can see at the top of the drawing. As you can see, the image is starting to take shape. The more volume you put in, the more detail you scratch out, you can now start comparing and contrasting where things are going and where you want to take them. The reason why this is an advanced cross-hatching is because of the scale on one hand and the number of elements involved. I've done earlier cross-hatching videos using Hunt 102, Hunt 107 on characters like Judge Dredd or Conan, but those are single images, and those are generally easier to deal with. The Conan piece is actually a scene, but it's relatively small, and it's got a few figures in it. And that wasn't too bad to balance, but I think on that piece I could have done a lot better. And because this is, again, a single character, not a very intense scene, but because of the scale, there's a lot more to manage. And to be able to manage it within one character versus a scene is its own challenge. And I wanted to see if I could rise to that challenge. Now, in a long history of crow quill inking and illustration, there are far better technicians at this than myself. I've loved inking since I was very young. I was really impressed more when I learned of guys like Heinrich Clay and Joseph Clement Cole, and even Franklin Booth, whose inking tended to reinterpret wood engraving or engraving in general as inked illustration. He had studied engravings thinking it was only pen and ink, and he was wrong, but he still continued to illustrate as if it was an engraving. There are other artists like Charles Dana Gibson, for instance, who was an amazing pen and ink artist. There's James Montgomery Flagg, who actually used brush. And if you've seen an earlier video that was in the style of James Montgomery Flagg, you'll see what I mean. The other impetus to do this project was I wanted to take an esoteric technique like pen and ink and do a sci-fi illustration. I think showing the future or the proverbial future using old school methods is kind of neat, kind of contrasting. I think if I were to do this again, I would try to do something even more futuristic, not like a retro future, but more like a future and see exactly how that plays out. Now, as I fill in the background, you see I'm using shorter strokes because if I start pulling long lines, then they start wavering. So I'm okay with using short strokes as long as it doesn't follow the short strokes underneath. So I might start in one corner for one angle and then start in a different corner for a different angle so that when I have to keep adding onto the line or the row of strokes, it'll start blending in a different way. So if you start squinting now, looking at the image that I'm inking, you'll see splotchy areas, and that's okay. You're gonna run into that. Eventually, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a pattern that makes sense, that the eye is tricked into believing, oh, this is all one value. By day 2 of inking on this piece, I was getting exhausted. My setup for doing these videos is not, well, let's just say it's not very ergonomic. I was getting a backache, I was starting to have neck pains, and frankly, I was kind of getting bored. I don't know, maybe bored isn't the right answer. Maybe it was, the thing is, this is tedious as it is, but to film it and ink, it just adds to the tedium. So yeah, I think I was just getting bored with the tenacity of it, but I persevered. And like anything worth doing, it's worth doing right. Hey gang, it's worth noting that I also have a Patreon. I cover a lot of stuff about comics and storytelling, as well as storyboarding and running your own freelance business at www.patreon.com/Shane Patrick White. I have 4 different tiers available for you to check out today. If you've ever had the desire to start your own art business, this is the Patreon for you at www.patreon.com/Shane Patrick White. As always, thanks for watching. And also, don't forget to subscribe to The Process. And please, if you have more questions, feel free to leave a comment below.